If you ask anyone to picture genius, chances are the image that pops into their head is Albert Einstein.
Definitely.
Maybe it's that equation, EMC 222. Or maybe it's that really iconic photo, the one with the wild hair, like intellect totally untamed.
Right, the sort of symbol of genius unbound by convention.
But the truth, well, as we found digging through all this material, the man himself was way more complex, contradictory even, and often, deeply humanly flawed.
Yeah, sick, exactly.
I mean, here's a guy who was a certified math whiz by age 12, yet he was also deemed medically unfit for Swiss military service when he was young. It's quite the contrast.
It really is. And that's our mission today, really. We're doing a deep dive into the sources, trying to get past that celebrity caricature and understand the actual person, Albert Einstein, across his whole life. All 76 years, from 1879 right up to 1955.
So we'll look at the revolutionary science, obviously the famous miracle year of 1905.
Yes, definitely. But also his personal life, which was frankly pretty messy at times, and his political views, which could be quite contradictory, and even how he became scientifically, well, somewhat isolated later on.
And we've got a lot to draw on. There's a huge amount of biographical data, scientific papers, letters, covering his entire career. We want to balance those early breakthroughs, relativity and all that, with the later stuff, his decades-long struggle to unify gravity and electromagnetism, which, in the end, didn't succeed.
Exactly. So this deep dive, it's really for you, the listener, if you're looking for the shortcut to genuinely understanding Einstein, moving beyond the icon to the complex human who, let's face it, fundamentally changed how we see the universe.
Okay, let's unpack this extraordinary life. So the sources kick us off with something, well, pretty astonishing, actually. When you think Einstein, you think lightning-fast intellect, right? But his parents? They were seriously worried early on. What did the sources actually say about his start?
It's one of history's great ironies, isn't it? His parents genuinely fretted he might have a learning disability because he was incredibly slow to learn to talk.
Really? Slow to talk?
Yes, very. He didn't speak in proper sentences until much later than most kids.
Right.
But then, once that intellectual engine started firing, I mean, it was just unstoppable. But the key thing is, it was driven by curiosity, not by formal schooling.
And that curiosity, it seems to have a very specific origin story. We actually know the moment that spark ignited, don't we?
We do, remarkably clearly. He was only 5 years old, sick in bed, and his father showed him a simple pocket compass.
The compass story.
Right, and he was apparently completely mesmerized by it. He realized there had to be some hidden force, something unseen, making that needle point so consistently north. He wrote later that this single moment sparked this lifelong fascination, this feeling that, quote, something deeply hidden had to be behind things.
Wow. And that philosophical jolt, it seems it translated almost immediately into this incredible academic self-sufficiency. He wasn't waiting for school, he was just teaching himself.
Absolutely. The sources are clear on this. Starting around age 12, he basically taught himself algebra, calculus, Euclidean geometry, mainly using textbooks his older cousin gave him.
So not following a curriculum, just pure self-drive.
Exactly. And get this, before he was even 13, he'd apparently found his own original proof for the Pythagorean theorem.
Seriously? At 12?
Yes. And by 14, he'd mastered integral and differential calculus. This wasn't just keeping up, this was leaping ahead.
I love that story about his tutor, Max Talmud. This university student was meant to be guiding young Einstein, right?
Right. And Talmud eventually had to admit he just couldn't keep up. The kid was just too fast, too deep. And this early self-taught mastery of advanced math, it really shaped his view of formal education. He was skeptical, particularly of the rigid environment at the Luitpold Gymnasium in Munich.
Yeah, that system really didn't mesh with him, did it?
Yeah.
What was his main objection to the German schooling of that era?
He found it stifling. The Luitpold Gymnasium had this strict, almost militaristic approach. Lots of rote learning, memorization. He felt it was, and the sources use the word harmful, actually harmful to creativity. He thought it valued obedience over genuine critical thinking.
And that friction really set the stage for his next big move, right?
Yeah.
His break from Germany.
It did. First, he tried to get into the Federal Polytechnic School, the ETH, in Zurich when he was just 16. He actually failed the entrance exam.
Einstein failed an exam.
Well, not in physics and math. He aced those sections,
Yep.
but he failed the general knowledge part. So that failure meant he had to go finish secondary school first in Aarau, Switzerland. And right around that time, he made a huge decision.
This was about his citizenship.
Yes, at 17, he formally renounced his German citizenship, specifically from the Kingdom of Württemberg. And he did it with his father's permission, primarily to avoid mandatory military service.
Wow. So he became stateless for a while.
Briefly, yes. It shows this really deep early aversion he had to militarism and state control. That was a theme throughout his life.
Okay, so let's jump ahead a few years. He finally graduates from the ETH in 1900. He's qualified to teach math and physics. And then? What? Nothing.
Pretty much 2 years of just frustration, rejection after rejection for teaching posts. He couldn't get a job. It actually took the father of a friend, Marcel Grossman, to step in and help him out.
And that led to the famous patent office job.
Exactly. The sources paint this picture of real academic struggle. He was tutoring just to get by. Then finally, in 1902, thanks to Grossman's father, he landed a permanent position as an assistant examiner, level 3, at the Swiss Patent Office in Bern.
The Bern Patent Office.
Yeah.
It always sounds like this slightly boring bureaucratic interlude in the life of a genius. But the sources argue it was actually the perfect place for him, scientifically speaking. Why?
It's all about what he was reviewing. His job involved assessing patent applications for things like transmitting electrical signals, coordinating clocks.
Synchronizing clocks.
Precisely. Clock synchronization across different locations. These weren't just abstract problems anymore. They were practical engineering challenges he had to evaluate day in, day out. And these very practical problems forced him into exactly the kind of thought experiments, Gedankenexperimente, as he called them, about measuring time and the speed of light. That was the bedrock of special relativity.
So his biggest breakthrough was essentially funded by a government job checking clock patents. That's incredible.
It really is. And he wasn't just doing patents. In the evenings, he had this other intellectual life going on, this group called the Olympia Academy.
Right, the grandly named discussion group. Just him and a couple of friends, wasn't it?
Yeah, just a few friends meeting in his small apartment. But the name's wonderfully ironic. And they weren't reading light stuff. They were tackling the big thinkers who were challenging the scientific status quo, Henri Poincaré, Ernst Mach, the philosopher David Hume.
So debating the very nature of space, time, causality.
Exactly. It just shows you don't necessarily need fancy labs for genius to flourish. You need intense discussion, challenging ideas, and that willingness to question absolutely everything.
Okay, so all that intellectual ferment bubbling away in the patent office just explodes in 1905. The sources call it his annus mirabilis, the miracle year.
Yeah.
People compare it to Isaac Newton's big year in 1666.
Yeah.
Just how significant were these 4 papers he published while still working as a patent clerk?
Oh, the magnitude is just immense. It's hard to overstate. These 4 papers basically laid the foundations for both pillars of modern physics in the 20th century, quantum theory and relativity.
And he did this while working full-time.
Essentially, yes. In his spare time, he tackled these huge, outstanding problems that the giants of physics have been wrestling with for years, and he solved them.
Let's break them down. The first one, on the photoelectric effect, this is the one that eventually won him the Nobel Prize. But it was actually the most controversial at the time, wasn't it? Why did it upset the physics establishment so much?
Because it fundamentally challenged the prevailing view of light. By 1905, light was firmly understood as a wave. You had centuries of evidence, Maxwell's equations describing electromagnetism as waves. It was settled science.
And Einstein comes along and says,
He proposed that light isn't just a wave, but that it also consists of localized packets or bundles of energy. He called them light quanta. Later, they got the name photons.
So light as particles, that flew in the face of everything they thought they knew.
Completely. The sources say the idea was nearly universally rejected at first. Even the big names like Max Planck, who'd actually laid some groundwork for quantum ideas, and Niels Bohr, who basically designed the modern model of the atom, they both initially rejected the particle nature of light. It was just too radical a leap.
It's amazing to think about that now. And it's crucial to remember you mentioned the Nobel Prize. He didn't actually get it for relativity.
That's right.
He got the 1921 Nobel Prize in physics specifically for his discovery of the law of the photoelectric effect. But the citation itself was, well, kind of careful, wasn't it? Still showing some doubt about the whole particle thing.
Exactly. The Nobel Committee was playing it safe. It wasn't until Robert Millikan did incredibly precise experiments that confirmed Einstein's math, and later Arthur Compton showed light scattering off electrons like tiny billiard balls, the Compton effect, that the photon concept really gained widespread acceptance. So the prize was for the law he discovered, not necessarily for the revolutionary idea behind it.
Okay. Paper number 2 from 1905, Brownian motion. This one maybe sounds a bit less glamorous than relativity, but it was incredibly important for settling a really fundamental debate, right?
Absolutely crucial. Brownian motion is that jittery, random dance that tiny particles do when they're suspended in a liquid or gas. People had seen it since the 1820s, but nobody could properly explain why it happened.
So what was Einstein's explanation?
He showed mathematically that the particles were moving because they were constantly being bombarded by the even tinier invisible molecules of the fluid itself. It was direct evidence of these unseen molecular collisions.
And why was proving that so vital?
Because it provided the first really solid quantitative evidence for the actual existence of atoms and molecules. Believe it or not, at the turn of the century, there were still very prominent scientists who thought atoms were just useful fictions, theoretical tools.
Not actual physical things.
Exactly. Einstein's paper basically turned these theoretical constructs into things whose effects could be precisely calculated and measured. It was a huge boost for statistical physics and the atomic theory of matter.
All right, then we get to the third paper, special relativity. So, before 1905, physics had these two great theories, Newtonian mechanics for moving objects and Maxwell's equations for electricity, magnetism, and light. But they didn't quite fit together, did they? What was the core conflict?
The conflict really centered on the speed of light. Maxwell's equations predicted that the speed of light was constant, always the same value, no matter how the source or the observer was moving.
But Newtonian physics would say speed should add up, right? If you run towards a light beam, you should measure it as going faster.
That's the classical intuition. Einstein's special relativity resolved this clash by taking Maxwell's constant speed of light as a fundamental postulate. If the speed of light is constant for everyone, he realized, then something else has to give. And that something else was our absolute notions of space and time. They become relative.
And in doing that, he killed off a famous, though purely hypothetical, concept, the luminiferous ether. What was that?
The ether was this invisible, undetectable substance that scientists imagined filled all of space. They thought it had to exist because waves, like sound waves, need air. Light waves presumably needed something to wave through.
The medium for light travel.
Right. But all experiments designed to detect the Earth moving through this supposed ether failed to find anything. Einstein's theory just elegantly sidestepped the whole issue. If the speed of light is constant in a vacuum, you don't need an ether. It simply becomes unnecessary. Space and time themselves are the framework.
And flowing directly out of special relativity comes the fourth paper, and maybe the most iconic equation in history. Mass-energy equivalence, EMC2I2.
Yes. This short paper, almost an addendum to special relativity, revealed something incredibly profound. Mass and energy are not separate things. They are fundamentally equivalent, interchangeable.
Mass is just incredibly concentrated energy.
Exactly. And the conversion factor is enormous, the speed of light squared. Chipitella too. This wasn't just some theoretical curiosity. It explained things like radioactivity and, crucially, laid the theoretical groundwork for nuclear power and, tragically, nuclear weapons. The sources aren't exaggerating when they call it the world's most famous equation. It permanently linked mass and energy. So special relativity was huge, but it had limitations. It only dealt with objects moving at constant speeds, and it didn't include gravity. The next big challenge for Einstein, which took him another decade of intense work, was to bring gravity into the picture.
This was the road to the general theory of relativity, which he finally completed in 1915. It apparently started with a key insight he had back in 1907, something called the equivalence principle. What was that big idea?
It was a brilliant thought experiment. He realized that the effects of gravity are locally indistinguishable from the effects of acceleration. Imagine you're in an elevator in deep space, accelerating upwards. You'd feel pressed to the floor, just like gravity.
Or if the elevator cable snaps on Earth, you feel weightless for a moment.
Exactly. You're in free fall, and locally, gravity seems to vanish. This equivalence meant he could think about gravity not as a force pulling things across space, like Newton did, but as a feature of space-time itself.
So he took special relativity's flat space-time and basically warped it. How did he incorporate gravity using this complex geometry? Riemann curvature tensors, 4 dimensions. It sounds incredibly complicated.
The mathematics is incredibly complex, yes. But the core concept, which physicist John Archibald Wheeler later summed up beautifully, is actually quite elegant. Space-time tells matter how to move, matter tells space-time how to curve.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
Think of space-time as a stretched rubber sheet. If you place a heavy ball like the sun onto the sheet, it creates a dip, a curve. Now, if you roll a smaller marble like the Earth nearby, it doesn't get pulled by some mysterious force from the ball. It simply follows the curve in the sheet created by the ball's mass.
So gravity isn't a force, it's geometry. It's the shape of space-time.
Precisely. Mass and energy bend space-time, and that bending is what we perceive as gravity. It was a complete paradigm shift.
Now, this radical new view of gravity wasn't just accepted overnight. But just 4 years later, in 1919, a specific astronomical event provided a dramatic test, and it catapulted Einstein from respected physicist to, well, global superstar.
That was the total solar eclipse of May 29, 1919. General relativity made a very specific prediction that light from distant stars passing close to the sun should have its path bent by the sun's immense gravity by a specific calculable amount.
More than Newtonian physics would predict.
Significantly more, yes. Newtonian gravity, depending on how you treated light, predicted either half the bending or none at all. So expeditions were sent out, led by the British astronomer Sir Arthur Eddington, to observe starlight near the sun during the eclipse.
And the observations.
They confirmed Einstein's predictions. The stars appeared shifted by just the amount general relativity calculated.
And the reaction was explosive.
Absolutely hysterical, by all accounts. Newspapers around the world went wild. Huge banner headlines. The Times of London famously declared, "Revolution in science, new theory of the universe, Newtonian ideas overthrown." It was front-page news everywhere. Overnight, Einstein became, as the sources say, perhaps the world's first celebrity scientist.
A status he really never lost. But this public icon had a private life that, according to the sources, was often pretty chaotic and full of contradictions. Let's talk about his first marriage, to Mileva marriage.
Right. Mileva was incredibly important. She was the only woman in his physics class at the ETH in Zurich, a brilliant physicist herself. They married in 1903 and had 3 children.
There was Liesl, the first daughter. Her story is quite sad, isn't it?
Very sad and uncertain. She was born before they married, and her fate isn't clear. She might have been given up for adoption or perhaps died in infancy. The records are just not conclusive. Then they had 2 sons, Hans Albert, who became a successful engineer, and Edward.
Edward's life was also quite tragic.
Yes, Edward, or Tet as they called him, was later diagnosed with schizophrenia and spent much of his adult life in institutions. It was a source of great sorrow for Einstein.
The marriage to Mileva was already strained by the time his fame exploded after 1919, and their divorce agreement that year included something really unusual about his future Nobel Prize money.
It's quite remarkable. As part of the divorce settlement, Einstein promised Mileva the entire sum of money he would receive if or perhaps when he won the Nobel Prize.
Which he did just 2 years later for the photoelectric effect.
Right. And he kept his promise. Mileva received the substantial prize money. It's often seen as acknowledging the debt he owed her, perhaps both emotionally and maybe even scientifically, given her own physics background.
Soon after the divorce, in 1919, he married again, this time to his cousin, Elsa Lowenthal. The sources point out the somewhat unusual family connection there.
Yes, she was his first cousin on his mother's side and his second cousin on his father's side. A bit complicated, perhaps unusual even then. But what the later sources, especially letters released by the Hebrew University, really highlight is that his marriage to Elsa didn't exactly bring fidelity.
Right. These letters revealed he was involved with several other women while married to Elsa.
Yes, the sources name a few. Marguerite Labach, who was married, Toni Mendel, a wealthy widow, his secretary, Betty Newman.
And there was also that connection with Margarita Korenkova, the Russian woman in Princeton who some suspected might have been a spy.
That's the rumor, yes. Whether true or not, the letters confirm a pattern of multiple romantic entanglements. So you have this picture of immense intellectual focus on the universe's structure, happening against a backdrop of significant personal chaos, constant travel, infidelity, difficult relationships with his sons. It seems his genius almost thrived or at least alongside this complexity. So becoming this global science celebrity after 1919 gave Einstein enormous influence, which he started using pretty actively on these extensive world tours starting around 1921.
His first big trip was to the United States. He got a huge welcome, met the mayor of New York, scientists. What were his initial impressions of America?
Generally very positive, according to the sources. He found Americans friendly, self-confident, optimistic, and without envy. He also used these trips, especially the early ones, to raise funds and awareness for causes he believed in, particularly supporting Zionism and the planned Hebrew University in Jerusalem.
Then came the big Asian tour in 1922 and 23. Japan, Singapore, Sri Lanka, Palestine. This is where we get some really interesting and sometimes quite jarring glimpses into his private thoughts from his travel diaries.
Yes, the diaries are quite revealing, and sometimes uncomfortably so. In Japan, for instance, he wrote very admiringly about the people modest, intelligent, appreciative of art. But then his private entries about the Chinese people he encountered, well, they are quite different.
How so?
The sources quote him describing them in ways that are, frankly, xenophobic and based on racial stereotypes. He wrote about them seeming spiritless and obtuse, and even expressed a fear that, quote, it would be a pity if these Chinese supplant all other races.
Wow, that's difficult to hear from the man who later became such a prominent voice against racism in America.
It is, and it's a crucial point the sources force us to confront. Here you have the global icon, publicly championing justice and equality, yet privately holding these kinds of prejudiced views, common perhaps for his time and background, but still deeply problematic. It really complicates that image of pure moral authority.
It forces you to separate the public figure and the private thoughts, maybe.
Or at least acknowledge the contradictions within the same person, the difference between his abstract intellectual commitments and his more visceral personal reactions.
So after Asia, he visited Mandatory Palestine. How was he received there?
Like royalty, basically. The sources mention ceremonies usually reserved for heads of state, even a cannon salute. He was deeply moved and expressed happiness seeing Jewish people gaining recognition and building a new life there.
Though his support for Zionism was nuanced, wasn't it? He wasn't a straightforward nationalist.
No, he wasn't. He actually opposed the idea of an independent Jewish state with borders and an army. His ideal was more towards a binational state where Jews and Arabs could coexist peacefully.
For about a decade, he also channeled his internationalism into more formal work, serving on the League of Nations Committee on Intellectual Cooperation.
Yes, from 1922 to 1932. He worked alongside other giants like the physicists Hendrik Lorentz and Marie Curie. The goal was to foster international scientific and cultural exchange, believing that intellectual collaboration could bridge national divides.
But that ideal of international cooperation was about to be shattered by events in Germany. In 1933, he was visiting the U.S. when the Nazis came to power. He knew instantly he couldn't go back.
He did, and the Nazi regime's reaction was immediate and vicious. The Gestapo raided his apartment in Berlin. As soon as he landed back in Europe, in Belgium, he went straight to the German consulate and renounced his citizenship for the second and final time.
He was everything they despised, wasn't he? Jewish, intellectual, liberal, internationally famous.
Exactly, a perfect target. His books were among those burned in the infamous Nazi book burnings. One German magazine even put him on an enemies list, offering a $5,000 bounty and adding the chilling phrase, "not yet hanged."
He must have known he was in real danger.
Absolutely. He found temporary refuge in England first. He even met with Winston Churchill there, urging him to help Jewish scientists escape Germany. Churchill actually took action, using his own scientific advisor to help place refugee scientists in British universities.
But his permanent home became the United States. He took up a position at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey in late 1933.
Yes, and he stayed there for the rest of his life, becoming a U.S. citizen in 1940. Princeton became this crucial sanctuary for him and many other scientists fleeing Nazi Europe. He really appreciated American freedom, that ability, as he saw it, for people to say and think what they pleased. He saw that as essential for science.
Okay, let's talk about maybe the biggest paradox of Einstein's life, his connection to the atomic bomb. Here's a man who was a lifelong, deeply committed pacifist.
Yes, very much so.
And ends up playing a key role in urging the development of the ultimate weapon.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
It came down to a terrible choice, really. Just before World War II started, a group of Hungarian émigré scientists, Leo Szilard, Edward Teller, Eugene Wigner, they were brilliant physicists who had fled Europe. They became aware that German scientists had achieved nuclear fission.
And they realized the horrifying possibility of a Nazi atomic bomb.
Exactly. So they went to Einstein, who was living out on Long Island that summer. They needed his fame, his credibility, to get the U.S. government's attention.
So Einstein, despite his pacifism, agreed to sign a letter to President Roosevelt.
He did. In August 1939, he signed the letter, drafted mostly by Szilard, warning Roosevelt about the German potential and recommending the U.S. start its own nuclear research program.
And that letter is seen as the crucial spark that ignited the Manhattan Project.
It's widely credited as such, yes. For Einstein, the pacifist, to take that step really underscores how immense he perceived the threat from Nazi Germany to be. It was a terrifying calculation.
But he came to regret it deeply, didn't he?
Profoundly. The sources mention that in 1954, just a year before he died, he called signing that letter his one great mistake. He still felt the immediate danger from the Nazis, perhaps justified it at the time, but the outcome haunted him.
That whole political struggle was happening alongside a major scientific struggle. In his later years, his deep disagreement with the way physics was evolving, particularly quantum mechanics.
Right. He became increasingly isolated from the mainstream of physics in the last few decades of his life. He just couldn't accept the fundamental randomness that quantum theory seemed to introduce into the universe.
This is where we get that famous quote about God not playing dice.
Exactly. God does not play dice with the universe. He believed deeply that underneath the probabilities of quantum mechanics, there had to be a deeper, complete, deterministic reality that physics could and should uncover. He felt quantum mechanics, as developed by Bohr, Heisenberg, and others, was successful but ultimately incomplete.
This disagreement led to those famous debates with Niels Bohr and also to the EPR paradox paper in 1935. What was that about?
EPR stands for Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen, his collaborators. It was a clever thought experiment designed to show that quantum mechanics had absurd consequences. It focused on entanglement, this strange quantum link where two particles can be connected no matter how far apart.
So if you measure one, you instantly know something about the other one. Faster than light could travel between them.
That was the implication Einstein found so troubling. He called it spooky action at a distance because nothing, according to his own theory of relativity, can travel faster than light. So he argued if quantum mechanics predicts this instantaneous connection, it must be missing something. It can't be the full story of reality.
Even though entanglement has since been experimentally confirmed time and time again.
Yes, ironically, the phenomenon he used to argue against quantum mechanics is now a cornerstone of quantum information science. But his primary scientific focus, his obsession really for his last 30 years, was something else, the unified field theory.
Ah, yes, the quest for the theory of everything. What was he trying to achieve?
Inspired by the success of general relativity in describing gravity geometrically, he wanted to find a single, elegant mathematical framework that could unite gravity and electromagnetism, the two fundamental forces known at the time as different aspects of the same underlying field.
A grand unification.
Exactly. He poured decades into this quest, publishing several attempts, but none of them really worked or gained acceptance in the physics community. And critically, his approach didn't easily accommodate the two other forces that were being discovered, the strong and weak nuclear forces, which were understood within the quantum framework he resisted.
It's interesting, though, that even while tackling these huge theoretical problems, he wasn't purely an abstract thinker. The sources mentioned he was also an inventor.
He was, yes. He held several patents. The most notable was probably the Einstein's Szilard refrigerator, which he co-invented with Leo Szilard in 1930.
A refrigerator? What's special about it?
It was an absorption refrigerator with no moving parts, just using a heat source. The idea was to make refrigerators safer and more reliable, as early models sometimes leaked toxic coolants. He also patented things like an electromagnetic pump for moving liquid metals. Practical problem solving was still part of his thinking.
And his activism continued in Princeton, too, especially concerning civil rights.
Very much so. He became a member of the NAACP in Princeton and was quite outspoken, calling racism America's worst disease. He didn't just talk about it either.
He corresponded with W.E.B. Du Bois, right?
Yeah.
And offered to testify for him.
Yes, when Du Bois was indicted on politically motivated charges in the early 1950s, Einstein offered to appear as a character witness. Just the prospect of having Einstein testify apparently led the judge to dismiss the case.
And that story about the singer Marian Anderson.
It's a wonderful anecdote. In 1937, the great black contralto Marian Anderson was giving a concert in Princeton, but the main hotel, the Nassau Inn, refused her a room because she was black. Einstein heard about it and immediately invited her to stay at his home. She accepted, and apparently, whenever she performed in Princeton after that, she stayed with the Einsteins. Her last visit was just a couple of months before he died. It showed his private actions matching his public principles on racial justice. You know, to really grasp the whole person, you absolutely have to talk about music. It wasn't just a hobby for Einstein. It seems like it was woven into the very fabric of his thinking.
He said that himself, didn't he? Something like, if I were not a physicist, I would probably be a musician. I often think in music. I live my daydreams in music.
Exactly. It seemed to provide a kind of structure, maybe an aesthetic satisfaction that resonated with his search for order in the universe.
He played the violin. Did he start young?
He did. Started lessons at 5, but apparently he hated the rigid lessons at first. It wasn't until he was about 13 and discovered Mozart's violin sonatas that he really fell in love with playing.
And he kept playing throughout his life.
Oh, yes. The sources mention he loved playing chamber music, often with professional musicians or colleagues like Max Planck, another accomplished musician.
And his taste in music is quite telling too, isn't it? His favorite was Mozart.
But he had a very clear preference for Bach over Beethoven. He once said, "Give me Bach, rather, and then more Bach."
That makes sense somehow. The mathematical precision.
Yeah.
The intricate structure of Bach.
Exactly. That logical purity seems to fit perfectly with his scientific mindset. J. Robert Oppenheimer, in a memorial lecture, tried to capture this essence of Einstein, describing him as someone almost wholly without sophistication and wholly without worldliness, but defined by a wonderful purity at once childlike and profoundly stubborn.
And that stubborn purity, that sense of doing things his own way, was really evident right at the very end, wasn't it, in his final moments?
Absolutely. On April 17, 1955, he suffered a rupture of an abdominal aortic aneurysm. He was taken to the hospital, but he refused surgery.
He just decided it was his time.
Yes. His reported words were, "I want to go when I want. It is tasteless to prolong life artificially. I have done my share. It is time to go. I will do it elegantly."
I will do it elegantly. Wow. That really says something.
It does, that sense of control, that philosophical acceptance. He died the following morning, April 18th, at the age of 76. And he was working almost right up to the end. The sources say he took a draft of a speech he was preparing for Israel's 7th anniversary with him to the hospital.
And then came that really strange postscript involving his brain.
Ah, yes, the brain's odyssey. During the autopsy, the pathologist, Dr. Thomas Stultz Harvey, removed Einstein's brain, supposedly for scientific study, but he did it without the family's explicit permission.
That's quite shocking. What was the idea?
Harvey hoped that future neuroscience might be able to analyze the brain and find the physical basis for Einstein's extraordinary intelligence. It was completely unauthorized and became this whole saga with parts of the brain traveling around with Harvey for decades.
A truly bizarre end for a man who valued his privacy so much. What happened to the rest of his remains?
They were cremated, and his ashes were scattered secretly at an undisclosed location exactly as he wished. He didn't want any grave or monument that could become a site of, personality cult worship. So when we look back at everything the sources tell us, what picture emerges? It's incredibly complex. You have the scientist who turned physics upside down in his 20s, but then spent his later years somewhat adrift from the quantum revolution he helped start.
You have the global peace icon whose private diaries revealed some really uncomfortable prejudices.
Right. And the committed pacifist who felt compelled to urge the development of the atomic bomb. It's full of these deep contradictions.
His intellectual property, his papers and archives, they ended up at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, as he intended. He was named Time Magazine's Person of the Century in 1999, and 2005 was declared the World Year of Physics to mark the centenary of that incredible annus mirabilis.
We tend to focus naturally on the huge successes like relativity. But here's something to think about for you, the listener. What do the sources suggest about the real value of those long, dedicated struggles that didn't ultimately succeed, like his 30-year chase for the unified field theory?
That dedication itself might be important, even in failure.
Exactly. How might that kind of profound, lifelong commitment to a single difficult problem shape scientific progress, even if the individual doesn't find the final answer? Maybe that stubborn persistence, that willingness to pursue a vision even when isolated, is one of the most powerful, if less celebrated, parts of his legacy. Something to really mull over.